Okay, so I've inspected the seals on this assembly. They look good. All I'm going to do, I get a cheap syringe at the drugstore like this so I can put the float fluid in and measure out exactly, because in a minute we're going to have to measure it out. So I'm just going to drip some onto this assembly, get the seals nice and lubed. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop it back down in the fork. But before it gets to right here, we're going to have to add 3 cc's or 3 millimeters of float fluid. And what I'm going to do is turn the fork sideways so it doesn't drip out the bottom. Okay, this is important. So I'm going to put a little bit back into the container here, which you can't see. So I've got 3 cc's of float fluid. I'm going to use my syringe and drop down in here. Then I'm going to put this assembly back in the fork, and I'm going to push it so that it comes out the bottom. And I'm going to use my socket wrench that I used to get it out and push it back down in there. Some fluid will drip out the bottom, but if you keep the fork turned sideways, then the fluid, most of it will stay in there, most of those 3 cc's that we just put in there. Okay, then we're going to get 3 more cc's or 3 more millimeters and put that in the top. Okay, now I'm going to straighten the fork out on the work stand. This is why it's nice to put it in the work stand, because it really gives you a third hand here. And so I'm going to grease the top cap just a little bit. This is called Slick Honey. I've had this sitting in my garage forever, but it's really made for suspension forks. And just put a little grease on the threads of the top cap. And very carefully put this back in. Now, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a little hole on the top of that unit that we pulled out. So you just want to make sure this goes in real straight. And that needle looking thing is going to go down inside that hole. Okay, so once you've got the top cap down in there, you're going to take the 26 millimeter wrench and just tighten it back up. Now, for the same reason that we loosened it when it was on the bike, we're going to fully tighten it when this is back together. So do it as tight as you can get it without using a lot of force, because again, this bolt does not stand up very much, and you do not want to strip this bolt. So I'm going to just tighten this down as good as I can get it in the stand without using too much pressure. Okay, so I'm snugging this up as snug as I can get it without risking stripping the threads. And I didn't really show it on the video, but sometimes you really have to line this top cap assembly up perfect for the threads to start catching. You got to kind of twist it around as you push it down in there, and it will seat down inside that lower assembly. And you got to get it just right for it to get low enough for the threads to catch. That's probably one of the trickiest parts about this. It just takes a little bit of trial and error. Okay, now I'm just going to use the Slick Honey. Now I'm going to just grease the top of this assembly, a little bit on the O-ring here, and also just put a little grease on this spring. Okay, now we're just going to drop this assembly, put the spring on and drop it down to the top cap assembly, and obviously there's a little hole that this needle needs to go through. Just make sure you line it up and drop it down in there. Okay, so what you want to do is this little groove right here, you want to be at the 11 o'clock position if you were kind of standing behind the fork and the front of the fork was 12 o'clock. You want that to be at the 11 o'clock position. That way when you put your Talas adjustment knob back on, it will be lined up correctly. So got that lined up. We're going to push this down, and then you're just going to take that spiral retaining ring that we took out and push it back, push this down in there. Okay, so take your spiral ring and just kind of work it down in there. You can kind of just twist it a little bit, push down on the Schrader valve as you do this. It makes it a little bit easier, and then just make sure that spiral ring fits really securely in the groove. And you can use, again, another flat blade screwdriver if you need to, or a dental pick to push that down in there all the way. I've actually got it with my fingers, and I'm going to go around and just make sure that that ring has popped into that groove. That's really important. Make sure it's seated in there good. Okay, at this point we're just going to add about 30 psi to the air spring. Okay, this is the point where I take just a paper towel or clean rag with isopropyl alcohol and just get the stanchion tubes really clean. Now, I didn't mention this before, but you've got an O-ring on the stanchion tubes to check your travel, and you probably want to push this all the way up to the top before you start this procedure. And if for some reason it comes off during this, just make sure you put it on good before you put the lowers back on. Okay, now we're just going to put some of the green suspension fluid in our syringe and just get some suspension fluid on the foam rings that are inside the seals. And I'm just going to drip some on there and just kind of turn it around. And those foam seals, obviously they're little foamy things inside your seal. So on both sides, just put a little suspension fluid on the foam. Okay, now we're just going to put the lowers back on. And you want to put them on real straight. Obviously make sure you are putting these on correctly. Make sure the left side is the left side and the right side is the right side. And the seals, just don't force these. Just make sure the seals go around the stanchion tubes nice and cleanly. They're not folded over. And we're going to slide these on, and then we're going to pour our oil in. So just bring them up to just high enough to where those bolts at the bottom aren't sticking out, because obviously we need some space to pour the oil in. Now I'm going to turn my fork upside down in the work stand, and we're going to pour the fork oil in through the top. And I actually will stand on a stool to do this because my work stand is kind of high and I need to put the oil in from the top. Okay, so I've measured out 10 cc's or 10 milliliters of suspension fluid in my syringe, and we're going to use this to put the oil in through the bottom of the fork, which is upside down, so we're going to put it in through the top. And we're going to put 10 milliliters in the spring side, which is the left side of the fork if you're standing behind the bike. So that's the side that has the Talas travel adjustment knob and where you add your air. That side is going to get 10 milliliters, and the right side, or the damper side, is going to get 30 cc's or 30 milliliters of suspension fluid. Okay, so I'm just going to use my syringe and drop in on the spring side 10 milliliters of suspension fluid. And I'm not going to show it, but I'm going to do the same thing on this side. This is the damper side, putting in 30 milliliters of suspension fluid. Okay, so I've got the oil in, and I've taken this out of the work stand to make this easier to show. But I push the lowers down so that the bolts will protrude out the bottom. And sometimes you need to make sure you guide with a screwdriver this protrusion where the rebound knob screws onto. Make sure it comes out the middle of the hole, and then we're going to put the bolts on. Okay, so I find it easier to put the bolt on the damper side first, the one with the metal washer. I snug that one up, and now I'm going to put the bolt on the spring side, and I've put my crush washer inside the bolt, and I'm going to actually push down the lowers as I do this so that the bolt will protrude. And I'm pushing down with one hand. I'm not going to be able to videotape this because it's hard to do with two hands. And then I'll just thread the other bolt, and I'm going to snug it up, and then I'll tighten them with a torque wrench in a minute. Okay, once you have both bolts on and snugged up, you want to use a torque wrench and tighten these to 50 inch-pounds on each one. Okay, so I've got the fork back on the bike. I've got the front wheel installed, headset, stem, everything tightened down. And I didn't mention this before, but obviously when you do this, it's a good opportunity to go ahead, just really wipe off your headset bearings, wipe out the cups, put a little bit of grease back on the bearings before you put them back in. So what we're going to do now, if you remember, we did not tighten this top cap down all the way. I'm going to put my 26mm socket wrench on the bolt of the top cap, and just like when we were taking it off, we want to put some pretty good pressure down on this bolt and tighten it back down, and you want to tighten it to 165 inch-pounds. So you kind of hold the front wheel with your legs, snug that thing up, and again put pressure down with your hand so that you do not strip the bolt with the 26mm socket set. Okay, now put your rebound knob back on, and like I said when I took it off, make sure you line up the screw with the indentation and tighten it back down with your Allen wrench. Okay, now we're just going to put the travel adjustment cap back on, and you want to line up the screws with the little holes underneath, and it's going to go on at about 11 o'clock. When you put this back on, the travel is in the lower setting, so your travel adjustment knob needs to be at about the 11 o'clock position, and then we're going to tighten the screws down with our 1/16 inch hex wrench. Okay, now we're just going to add the air to the fork, and I typically run about 65, so I'm just going to put in 65 psi into the fork. And finally, just put your cap back on, tighten it down, and you are ready to roll. And again, it's a little bit easier to put this cap back on with the travel adjustment knob in the lower travel setting. It makes the cap stick up a little bit higher. It's easier to take on and off. And just push down, and you really should notice that the fork feels smoother after this procedure. Check your travel adjustment. Just make sure that the fork extends properly to the longer travel setting, and you're ready to go ride.